Hi everyone. Tonight we're going to talk about the American Revolution. Now, the American Revolution is a lot more than just the years spent actually fighting the war. There are all the different steps that we take going from being very happy colonists to being ready to break with Mother England. One of the best ways to look at the colonies by the time we get to the middle 1700s is looking at us like teenagers and as England as mom. And you know how you are when you're kids and you get to that time period when you're in high school and you start feeling like you can do this and you don't need them anymore. And so that's kind of how the colonies are going to start feeling starting after the French and Indian War. Let me give you the outline of how we're going to go through the different steps that lead up to the Revolutionary War. You know, last class we ended off with the end of the French and Indian War, and at the end of that war in 1763, we're quite happy to stay with Mother England. We're very proud to be British. We just, beat the bad guys, or what we thought were the bad guys, and come out on top. And so we were very happy to be Englishmen. But over the next 20 years, we're going to change our ideas about whether or not we wanted to be tied to the mother country anymore, and the ideas about independence are going to change. And this is very important to keep in mind as we're going through this time period. With the French and Indian War, Great Britain is going to wind up in an extraordinary amount of debt. Because of having not only to wage war 3,000 miles over here, but they also had war break out, the 7 Years' War, over in Europe. And so they're fighting a two-front war, and it becomes very, very expensive. So it's going to leave England in a lot of debt. And so their prime minister is going to come up with different ways to be able to recoup those losses. And that's going to happen through mercantilism and the Navigation Acts. Now, if you recall, the main goals of mercantilism are to create a self-sufficient unit and create a favorable balance of trade. And you want the mother country and the colonies to work together and not fight against each other. And so by regulating the trade with the Navigation Acts, England was able to establish a mercantilism that was in their favor. But if you recall, with salutary neglect, for years and years, they really had not enforced them. A lot of the trading companies out of the colonies would go along with it, and so it wouldn't be all that bad. But as time goes on, more and more of the colonists and the American trading companies are going to find better markets that they want direct access to, and so they're going to go around the Navigation Acts. And so with salutary neglect, the mother country, Great Britain, is going to allow the colonies to become very, very, very independent. It's kind of like that kid, that teenager whose parents let them run and go and do whatever they want to do. They don't have a curfew. They don't have any rules they have to go by. And then all of a sudden, mom and dad decide to put the brakes on and throw up all kinds of barriers. Now they have a curfew and they have all kinds of rules they have to go by. They don't have access to the car anytime they want it. And that teenager starts bucking up against the restrictions of their parents. Well, every time they buck up against it, then the parents are going to put on more restrictions, and they're going to buck up at it. And so that's going to be that tug of war that's going to happen between the teenage colonies and the mother country adults as the mother country starts to put more restrictions on the colonies and trying to recoup the debt that they incurred with the French and Indian War. Well, with these restrictions are going to come complaints from the colonists. And one of these was a complaint that they were not being able to send representatives to speak for them in Parliament. Parliament's going to come back and say, oh, no, we've got this. You are being virtually represented over here. We have lots of people over here in this country that can't vote for the people that are in Parliament, but we're still representing them, so we're still representing you. Well, the colonists are going to come back and say, but people in England have got access to people who can vote and can voice their concerns in that way, and we don't have that ability. So virtual representation is going to be a sticking point in this conflict back and forth between the colonists and Mother England. Another one is going to be the writs of assistance. With writs of assistance, the British government had authorized themselves to be able to grant these customs officials the authority to just walk into your house and search for smuggled goods without any kind of warrant whatsoever. And so those kinds of encroachments on long-standing Englishman liberties are going to drive a lot of this conflict that's going on between the colonists and Great Britain. Of course, all of this is going to lead to the cry of taxation without representation as we start talking about the different taxes that are going to be placed upon the colonists to try and get back this debt that that Britain owns. One of the first ones, of course, is going to be the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act is passed in 1764, and it's going to place a tax on sugar. And back in this time, sugar was not something that everybody had on their table. Only the wealthy had sugar. And so it didn't bring in as much revenue as as Britain would like to have had. And so they're going to find a broader area. So it's kind of like, taxing the rich. When you tax the rich, that you're going to get something out of that, but you don't have that many. There's not enough wealthy even now to be able to fund everything else everybody else wants to do. And so the government will start looking for a broader span of people to tax. And so they're going to repeal the Sugar Act, and then they're going to come out in 1765 with the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act is going to cover everybody. It's going to be a tax placed on all kinds of paper goods. So licenses, marriage certificates, newspapers, anything that had to do with paper, stationery, would have a tax affixed to it. Even playing cards and dice were subjected to the Stamp Act. And so this is going to cover a whole lot more people, and so it's going to create the largest amount of pushback by the colonists. So the next step is going to be the creation of the Stamp Act Congress. And out of the Stamp Act Congress is where you're going to get your Sons of Liberty. Your Sons of Liberty, and later the Daughters of Liberty, are going to be your more radical thinkers who are really going to lead the charge against Mother England with all of these different kinds of taxes and the encroachment on what they feel are their rights as Englishmen. Now, this next graph is kind of just an overall idea of all the different things that are going to lead us on the road to revolution. So you have mercantilism, you have the French and Indian War, you have restrictions, you have the idea that we've been left alone and allowed to do our own thing for the longest, along with your Enlightenment ideas and your Great Awakening that are all kind of underneath all of this. And so these are the things that are going to lead in this resistance to Mother England. I want to show you this next graphic. This is a little teapot that was made over in England, and there's no Stamp Act. On the other side of it, it says Stamp Act repealed. And this was just kind of a way of, people in England saying, well, you got what you wanted. What are you fussing about now? But people in America have their own institutions. The reason they were bucking up against the taxes to help pay for the French and Indian War was because they felt like they had already put in their part in fighting this war. They had sent soldiers, they had sent supplies, they had their own taxes. The government units had been over here for some time. This next slide I have here, this is the inside and the outside foyer of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. Now, I already told you guys I am this history nerd that likes to go on history vacations. And so when I was in Virginia visiting my kids, I took a trip over to Colonial Williamsburg, and they actually have the House of Burgesses. And so this is inside the one of the early government buildings of what becomes now the United States. And so the Sons of Liberty are going to rally support, and they're going to lead a boycott against British goods in retaliation for this Stamp Act. And it's going to be such an organized effort that the British government is going to repeal the Stamp Act and replace it with the Townshend Acts. Now, in the meantime, they are also going to pass two other things that are not taxes. One of them in 1765 is the Quartering Act. Now, the Quartering Act was where they could assign however many soldiers they want to live in colonist houses. So, you get 5 soldiers, and you get 5 soldiers, and you get 5 soldiers, and they move into your house, and they get the best of everything, and you guys all get sloppy seconds. And it all came out of your pocket. The government wasn't, giving you any kind of allowance to feed these men or house these men. And so that was the Quartering Act. It also had the military eavesdropping on everything you did. I mean, think about if you had a government official forcefully living in your house, what you wouldn't say to each other, and how that would manage to, keep you quiet about things if they were living right under your roof. And so it's going to irritate the colonists with this Quartering Act. The other thing is the Declaratory Act. And with the Declaratory Act of 1766, Parliament is going to assert its right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So anything that the mother country wants to do, the colonists have to go along with it. It's kind of like when they say jump, you have to say when and how high. And so those are going to be those kinds of things that are really going to irritate the colonists. So Parliament is going to repeal the Stamp Act, and they're going to replace it with the Townshend Acts, or the Townshend Acts, sometimes is how they're pronounced. And with the Townshend Acts of 1767, this is going to be an import tax on all kinds of things like glass and white lead and paper and paint. They're also going to place 2 new regiments of soldiers in the colonies to keep an eye on what those guys are doing. And so, like I said, the more restrictions that get put on, the more the colonists are going to push back against the mother country. You're going to have, by 1770, enough conflict going on that it's going to break out into violence. It's going to be wintertime in Boston, and you have a bunch of Boston colonists that are aggravated about all the British soldiers in their town. And so while the soldiers are standing guard in their positions, you're going to have the colonists picking at them and taunting them and throwing things at them. And it's going, just think about it, someone's always in your face saying, come on, shoot me. And at some point, whether intentional or not, someone's going to lose control. And all it takes is one shot. And that's what happens with the Boston Massacre. One of the soldiers gets hit by either one of the little billy clubs they used to beat out ropes. They were all, ship makers or boatswains, or worked in the shipping industry one way or another, and they had these little mallets about this big they used to beat out rope with. And so it could have been that, it could have been a piece of ice, it could have been a seashell, but they were throwing things at these soldiers while they're standing at attention, and one of them stumbles and the musket goes off, and it just kind of opens fire. And you're going to have 5 colonists killed, including the first black killed in the Revolutionary War, and that's Crispus Attucks. It's important to understand that African Americans have fought in every single war, from the French and Indian War all the way to the current conflicts. There have been black soldiers in every single one, and that's important to remember. And so Crispus Attucks is the first black to sacrifice himself for American liberty at the Boston Massacre. Now, another interesting point about the Boston Massacre is that it doesn't really cause a lot of outcry across all the colonies, because at the same time as the Boston Massacre is happening, Parliament is repealing the Townshend Acts. This right here is a lithograph that was created by Paul Revere of the Boston Massacre. And you've got the big bad British like this, and you have the poor colonists over here like this. And it's a total piece of propaganda. It is very biased, and it didn't really happen that way. And if you ever had the opportunity or get the opportunity to see John Adams, the miniseries, it depicts this really, really well. And John Adams, as a lawyer, is asked to defend the British soldiers because nobody else was going to do it. They kind of had to twist John Adams' arm into doing it. And so he is going to defend them against these charges of murder and basically get them all, most of them acquitted. As he was looking at all of the facts and talking to all the witnesses, as it turns out, you have the Sons of Liberty standing behind those soldiers, yelling "Fire, damn you, fire!" and taunting them on. The leader in this particular lithograph, you have the leader behind him. He was actually in front of them, and they're not going to fire on their own leader. And so the Boston Massacre is always talked about, but as far as outcry across the colonies, it doesn't cause a really large outcry. So when Parliament repeals the Townshend Acts, they're going to leave only one piece of it, and that's the Tea Act. And with the Tea Act, all of American tea had to be imported from the East Indies, and they didn't like that much. And this is when Americans are going to move away from being large-scale tea drinkers and start to drink a lot of coffee, because they're going to, go against this. They're going to boycott it. And you're also going to have the Sons of Liberty that are going to enact what becomes known as the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Now, the Boston Tea Party is not where they're all sitting around sipping tea and eating crumpets. This is when Sons of Liberty are going to dress up as Native Americans and board the British ships that are in the harbor and dump all the tea off into the port of Boston. They're going to dump so much tea, it's going to turn the harbor brown. I mean, it was a lot of money that they have dumped off into Boston Harbor, and this is going to totally outrage Parliament, because not just because of this act of insurrection, but also because of the loss of money. I mean, think about this: a lot of people will put up with a lot of stuff until you start hitting them in the pocketbook, and then they're going to say, "Oh no, that's not going to happen." And so with the Boston Tea Party, Parliament's going to come back with what become known as the Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Acts. It's the same acts. Parliament's going to call it the Coercive Acts. They're trying to coerce us into doing what we're supposed to be doing, into compliance. And we're going to say this is absolutely intolerable and we can't put up with it. Okay? And so with one of the big pieces of the Intolerable Acts is they're going to close the port of Boston. So they're going to barricade with British ships the port of Boston until Boston pays back the cost of all of the tea that got dumped and that was lost in the harbor. And it seems like it's really, harsh, and it was, but it's also rather ridiculous, because if you're going to expect someone to pay you money and then you're going to cut off their access to trade so they can't make any money, then it's going to make it difficult for you to get your money back. Also, with the Intolerable Acts, they're going to further restrict colonist rights. If you got in trouble for something, you were going to be taken back over to England to be tried over in England for crimes committed over in the colonies. And so the colonists are going to further feel like they have been ill-used and being put upon by Mother England. And then in 1775, because of the opening of the actual Revolutionary War, the Prohibitory Acts are going to be passed by Parliament, and that is basically where Great Britain says that the colonies are in open rebellion, and they're going to suspend all trade with the colonies from that point on. So those are the different legal actions that have been taken. Let me go back and make sure you understand which ones are taxes, though. So the Sugar Act is a tax, the Stamp Act is a tax, the Townshend Acts are a tax, and the tax on tea. Those are the 4 things that are taxes. All the rest of those are regulations and not taxes. So it's important that you know which is which on that. Now, I want to give you kind of a list off, and I know this is in your notes, but I also want to give you kind of a list off of the actions that are going to happen as we go from the Boston Tea Party all the way into to the end of the war. Keep in mind that at the beginning of the Revolution, there are 2.5 million colonists in the American colonies. So the population is rather large. Okay. And so in 1770, you have the Boston Massacre. Right. Remember what I said a minute ago? Because of that, and it happens at the same time as the repeal of the Townshend Act, so you don't have a lot of outcry. 1773, you've got the Boston Tea Party. Okay. 1774, the First Continental Congress is going to meet. Now, with the First Continental Congress, you have got a very short time meeting. This is when George Washington is assigned to be the leader of the Continental Army. This is when they come up with the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. It's the first list of issues that the colonists have with Mother England that they're going to send to King George, and say, this is the problem. Can you do something to help us work this out? You know, at this point, they're still trying to work it out. They're not talking yet about breaking with the mother country. You know, I mean, this is kind of like that kid who is, you know, they've taken off for a day. You know, they've run off and spent the night at their friend's house. They've not moved out yet. They've just kind of run off to, you know, kind of give some space. Okay. And then, but in 1775, you're going to have the first opening shots, and that's going to be the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and so it is officially known as the opening of the Revolutionary War. Okay, it happens up in Massachusetts. In Concord, the British basically get the colonists on the run. They run back to Lexington, and they ambush them in Lexington and run the British all the way back to Boston, taking pot shots at them all the way. The British did not like the fact that the Americans didn't fight fair. One of the things you're going to find in with your notes is a clip to something called Polite War. And it's a funny little clip about how the British thought we were going to fight fair and we didn't. So you might want to take a look at it. It's not mandatory, but you might want to take a look at it. And then in 1775, you have also the Second Continental Congress that is going to meet. And this one's going to stay around for a whole lot longer. It's out of the Second Continental Congress that you're going to get the Olive Branch Petition. So it's going to be our last ditch effort trying to get King George to see our side of it and try to work something out. He's going to go, no, not going to happen. Also in not in 1775, much later, about 75 years later, you're going to have Ralph Waldo Emerson is going to write a poem about this time period called The Shot Heard Round the World, and that is about the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Also at the Second Continental Congress is when they're finally going to decide that we need a Declaration of Independence. We need to give our side something to fight for. And we also need to give the rest of the world something to understand why we're doing this. And I'll go into that a little bit more here in a second. In 1777, you have the Battle of Saratoga. Now, the Battle of Saratoga is important because it's a turning point in the war. It is a glorious victory for the colonists against the British. That is because of a man named Benedict Arnold, not because of General Gates. General Arnold and General Gates had worked together for some time, and every time that that this team would win a battle against the British, Gates would take all the credit. he did the same thing with the Battle of Saratoga, when in reality it was Arnold that had come up with all the strategy that helped them win the battle in both cases. Well, with the Battle of Saratoga, he is going to finally have had enough. He's going to stomp off. His wife is the daughter of a British colonel, and so this is when Benedict Arnold is going to switch sides. And so when someone calls you a Benedict Arnold now, they're calling you a traitor. But also with the Battle of Saratoga, because it is a glorious victory, this is when the Treaty of Alliance gets signed with France. And France is going to come in on our side because of the Battle of Saratoga. Now, the Treaty of Alliance was put together by Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. And it is going to give us supplies and money as well as forces, because at this time period the American currency was very weak. It had always been under supported by the British pound, and we didn't have that anymore, and so it is going to be very weak. Now, the last battle is the Battle of Yorktown. Here I have pictures for you of all of several different places in Yorktown. Let me see if I can change this so you can see just the pictures, but I don't know that I can. But these would be the tents for the enlisted men. These are officer tents. This view right here is looking from the American lines towards, no, I'm sorry, from the British lines towards the American lines, and right out there is where the British are going to see the French sitting. And that's what's going to cause the British to finally give up. This right here is a pikes, where it was kind of a barrier for militaries to keep this other side from attacking them. Here is just different parts of the town. So people lived right there on the battleground. The idea that battles are fought way far away is something that is 20th century. The Civil War, the Revolutionary War, it was fought around in people's fields and across the street and up and down the streets, and so it was like right there in your face. And so the Battle of Yorktown is significant because it is where General Cornwallis is going to surrender to American forces, and it's the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. Now here is a map of all the different northern battles, for the most part, of the Revolutionary War. Now Yorktown is right down here in Virginia. The kind of gives you an idea where things were and stuff. I also want to talk about some of the significant reasons why we did certain things. So, like why, what kind of strengths and weaknesses we had. And this chart here gives you a better idea of strengths and weaknesses. So, we're fighting our own war. We're fighting for a passionate cause. We're fighting on our own territory, and that makes a big difference. Even though Britain had a military that was the strongest military in the world at the time, and the largest, they were really well organized. They were really well trained, and poor old George Washington, he couldn't keep our guys together for his life. If it hadn't been for von Steuben, a Prussian, helping him train our guys, it might not have happened. There was a horrible winter at Valley Forge, where most of the men had no shoes. They had smallpox and they had frostbite. Interesting story about Valley Forge. My maiden name is Deweese, and I do a lot of ancestry stuff. And you trace my maiden name back, and I'm a direct descendant of one of the co-owners of Valley Forge during the war, and that's on my dad's side. On my mother's side, you trace my lineage back, and I'm a cousin of George Washington. So one side of my family spent the winter at Valley Forge with the other half of my family, and they didn't even know it. And so, trying to get this ragtag army put together so that it could fight against the strongest military in the world was probably an act of God. And so but this chart here kind of gives you an idea of the strengths and weaknesses on both sides. I mean, one of the weaknesses of the British was that their supply line was really, really long. It was 3,000 miles. And so trying to keep the military supplied was always a challenge. A couple of the major names besides George Washington and Cornwallis that come out of this war are the Swamp Fox and then Tarleton. Now, if you have ever seen the movie The Patriot, then the Swamp Fox is represented by the Mel Gibson character, Benjamin. And then, and the reason I have Tabington written next to Tarleton's name, because that is who represents Tarleton in this movie. Now, in the movie, they've added some things, Tarleton never ever once locked people in a church and set the church on fire. Now, he burned down a lot of churches, but he never did it with people inside of it. Now this picture right here I want you to see, that is the Swamp Fox's gun. That is a musket, and it is huge. If you stand it up on its end, it stands tall. I'm 5'2", and it stands taller than me. But these are single shot muskets, and so the way that they shot was in a revolving type of thing. So you had people down on their stomachs, people up on their knees, men up standing up, and they would shoot, and then it would rotate. So the people behind would step in because you had to have time to reload your weapon. And so the battle lines, it took a lot of ingenuity on the Patriots' part to defeat this well-organized military. The other thing that was going on in this country was that not everybody was a patriot. Only a third of the colonists were patriots. Another third were loyalists. They believed that we should stay with Mother England. I mean, yeah, the taxes are horrible, but we still need to stay with Mother England. And then you have that neutral bit in the middle. And it's going to be the brutal actions of the British during the war that are going to drive these neutrals to the Patriot side. Does that make sense? I hope so. The military was all militia, so that means they're all volunteer. They were paid very, very poorly. Another thing to remember is that the Tories were led by a guy named Thomas Hutchinson. Now, Tories are the loyalists. Now, loyalists were not treated very well. The Patriots are going to burn down their places and run them off and terrorize them if they're not going to join the Patriot effort. So there was brutality on both sides. There's a couple of names you need to remember. One of them is Sam Adams. Yes, that's the cousin of John Adams. He was pretty much a failure at everything, even though we do name a beer after him today. The only thing he was really, really good at, he was a true revolutionary. He could rally people to the cause. And so he was the leader of the Sons of Liberty. And then there's this guy here, and I know all of you have heard of this guy here, Thomas Paine. He writes this pamphlet right here called Common Sense, and it was a brochure about why the colonists needed to strike for independence and break from the mother country. And so with the First Great Awakening and these the religious tracts that get spread across the colonies, it was very easy for this pamphlet to also spread throughout the colonies, who by this time enjoy reading and do a lot of it. So when we get to the Treaty of Paris, you're going to have America that is totally different than what it started off with. So England is going to get shoved up here into Canada. Now they're going to get control of British Canada for a very long time. I cannot remember now exactly when Canada becomes independent of British control. You're going to have Spain has all this over here, and then this piece over here on the west coast is still going to be contested by Russia and Spain and Britain and now the United States. And then the United States is going to be this green part right here. So it is north of Florida to Canada and from the Atlantic to the Mississippi in 1783. Okay. Now, before I get too much further into the Treaty of Paris, I want to go back and talk about the Declaration of Independence. Now, I know this is in your notes, but I want to make sure you understand how this document is laid out. You have got the preamble to it. And the preamble to the Declaration of Independence is not the one you memorized in the 6th grade. That is We the People, the one that you have the song that goes with. When you're talking about the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, you're talking about the one that starts off, when in the course of human events. And as you're looking at that preamble in that introduction, you have the speaker, which is going to be the people. Yes, I know Thomas Jefferson wrote it, but he is speaking for the people. So the people are doing the speaking. They are speaking to mankind in general. They're telling the world, this is what we're doing, and the reason why they're doing it. So their purpose. So the purpose is that last line, to declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Okay, so that's your introduction. And then the middle part of the Declaration of Independence are, you have your philosophy lined out. So according to Thomas Jefferson, only the people could create a government, and that the purpose of that government was to provide security and safety. And then if that government failed in providing security and safety, the people could overthrow that government and establish a new one. Okay, and that philosophy is based off the writings of John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and a man named Montesquieu. John Locke is where we get the idea of the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, yes, when John Locke when he said it, it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. But Thomas Jefferson changes that to happiness, because he figures if you have property, you're happy. Now, keep in mind, it's the pursuit of happiness. You do not have the right to happiness. You have the right to pursue it. And then Thomas Hobbes was the one who came up with the social contract, that idea that government is to provide security and safety so the people can go about pursuing life, liberty, and happiness. And in return, then the people will give their loyalty to the government. And that's that social contract. And then out of Montesquieu, you have the idea of federalism. It will show up more in our Constitution, and the separation between central power and local power. And then in the middle of it, you have your grievances, and there's a whole bunch of them. The most well-known, of course, they were upset about no trial by jury, being taxed without representation, their trade being cut off, the obstruction of justice were their biggest things. Basically, they're calling King George III a tyrant because all these things are being done to them. All right? And then in the last paragraph, they're going to basically declare their independence, and then they're going to pledge their lives, their honor, their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. So they're giving everything they have. And if you go back and look at what happened to the men that signed the Declaration of Independence, they gave everything. I mean, they're going to be men that are going to come back, and everything they owned is going to be burned to the ground. Their families are going to be off in hiding. Their sons are going to die in the war. So these guys are not taking it lightly. They're not just signing this and sending a bunch of other people off to take care of business. They are totally entrenched in what they're doing. Now, these guys, as soon as they sign the Declaration of Independence, are traitors, according to the British government. And so they're going to be in hiding. They don't. The picture of all of them signing the Declaration of Independence at the big painting, that was painted during John Quincy Adams' administration, and his father hated it because it was nothing like what happened. They all had to kind of sneak in to get it signed. Another little interesting thing about my family, once they got the Declaration of Independence done, and they had written out 16 copies, there were 16 broadsides that were done so that they could be read out across the colonies, because they didn't have massive printing presses like we have now. And so Germantown, Pennsylvania, which is now part of Philadelphia, was the closest town to where they got all this finished. And so in Germantown, Pennsylvania is where my family comes out of, and there was a Colonel William DeWeese who was the sheriff of Germantown, and he authorized the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence right after it was authorized. So a little trivia history there. Now, with the Treaty of Paris, you have got, of course, it ends the Revolutionary War. We are now independent. We have gone from being 1763, very happy colonists, to 1783, and now we're totally broken apart from the mother country. And it's going to set the boundaries. It's going to force Great Britain to admit that we are now independent. But it's also going to be one of those things of be careful what you ask for, you might just get it. And so we now have to figure out what we're going to do now. How do we govern? Who's going to be in charge? What is political equality? What kind of government are we going to have? That division of power. How are we going to work all this? And so now we have a whole new can of worms to deal with. And so as we move next week into chapters 6 and 7, because next week is both chapters together, we're going to talk about how we go from now we're free to, oh my gosh, now what do we do? So between now and then, you guys have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.